Hello. Today I'd like to take a look at a topic related to fears. We all have fears, and I think for most of us, we spend most of our time and energy trying to manage fears, and they dominate us so much that we have very little left to be happy and calm and grow. Now, if we were to take some time away from the hustle and bustle, we could probably sit down with a sheet of paper in hand and outline what some of our biggest fears are. So this is an attempt to look at the best ways that I have come to think of to overcome specific fears that we might identify that tend to vex us or trouble us greatly. So the first approach, I think, and a very, very common one, is to try and control whatever it is we fear from happening. You could say to try and control it away by planning or by educating ourselves how to get mastery over this situation that makes us fearful. Let's say something that might happen in the future. There is, for instance, the phrase we've all heard of before, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. And so I think most of us would say, what better way to prevent something than either to plan how not to see it happen in the future, or to try and save up enough money to buy our way out of any eventuality even. You might also try, for instance, to purchase insurance plans of various sorts for any eventuality to come, including long-term health insurance and health insurance in general, and life insurance, car insurance, house insurance, fire insurance, so on. But of course, for many, this is not much of an option if they don't have the money for policies like this or quality policies in general. Another approach that I alluded to is to try and educate yourself about this situation in the hopes that with more facts, more knowledge, one can thus avoid certain situations through planning or just general insight on the matter. Another way that some people I see try and approach handling of fears, specifically of something they consider bad might happen in the future, is to put themselves in the most unstressful and most unrelenting environments possible. So, for instance, as people age, many may desire to get out of urban areas and move to the country, whereby there's a slower pace of life, and whatever does happen to you tends to happen at a slower pace of rate of pace, so that one has more time for thinking, planning, and adapting in general, as well as getting help when things start to crop up in a negative way. The idea that if you're very pressed and things happen in hustle and bustle fashion, then you cannot have the time to react in a timely or in a non-rushed fashion. Everything you will do will be a knee-jerk reaction. Another way of trying to overcome specific fears we may have about something in the future in particular is to build allies. The idea that no man is an island. For instance, in that movie About a Boy with Hugh Grant, whereby at the end of the movie he concluded that the best way for him to approach life was to stop being an island, as he put it, and have friends, allies, relationships. Now, for those who cannot seem to make any of these things happen or wish to supplement such approaches, I've seen what you might call fleeing areas or relationships you might call toxic or war-torn. For instance, during a war, some people might wish to go to another country, become refugees, or after the war, in fact, leave that region entirely and emigrate to a supposed Shangri-La location, America, for instance, many might say. And, for instance, too, consider religious persecution, which you might say is experienced by a specific group here and there who have specific fears. Sometimes what will happen, I've observed, is that these people will leave the area that is causing so much fear for them, such as when Mormons left the East and went to Utah, or when the Puritans left England and came to America, or likewise when the Amish left the Switzerland region and came to America too, again feeling religious persecution. Or let's say you are a writer, the famed Voltaire. He felt so much persecution in terms of what he wrote that he went to England and found a much freer and open environment for him to write, thereby overcoming specific fears he had in this manner. And now, consider those who can neither plan their way out of certain fears, to include maybe by piling up a lot of money to throw at problems in the future, or also cannot flee the area. Some fewer people have taken up a third option I've noticed, and that is to have an out, a way of coping somehow of a radical nature. Let's say, taking a look at the Nazi era in Germany in the 1930s, I've read that a number of the high-ranking party officials of the Nazi regime carried with them in some form cyanide and access to a gun, such that some of the top officials, right after the war was over, used both cyanide and guns, not only on themselves, but often on all their family members too, or their spouse, at least, to avoid what it was they most feared: imprisonment, torture, a total change of life, total lack of liberty at a minimum. Then, too, there are those who perhaps are soldiers and possibly anticipate being captured. The military then may also provide them training as to how to be a prisoner of war. In other words, they're planning ahead for eventualities of what you would ordinarily think is a catastrophe. Indeed, there is the fabled notion, perhaps with some truth, I know, that some of the spies who have served for our country have teeth filled with cyanide, at least one tooth. Again, an out, should they be captured and not wish to be a prisoner of war and tortured. Such as John McCain, by the way, suffered some 6 years, I believe, in a prisoner of war camp. Of course, there are those like the Naval SEALs, soldiers of an elite nature, who undergo rigorous training on how to combat interrogation and torture. But I suspect that is something that most of us would not want to entertain as an approach in life. So, with all of this, I think there is possibly one other option that is not so often talked about. And I've observed this generally to be spoken about in what you might call religious circles, and that is acceptance, or counting on a out, if you will, or also a reward afterward for what it is we suffer from in terms of what we most fear. So perhaps from the Buddhist perspective, let's say in India, some people there urge acceptance of what could happen no matter what, with, I would say, my own 2 cents worth being a realization at the same time that no matter what happens to us, it matters a whole lot that we not regard it as a catastrophe, nor something to be ashamed of. In other words, a blow to our ego, if you will, for lack of a better word. For it strikes me that many or most of our fears might be greatly diminished if only we didn't catastrophize them and regard it as something totally horrendous. This going back to the notion or idea of eternal punishment in Christianity, for instance, the hell doctrine, which I would say is definitely a catastrophe were it to happen. And so the problem being, I think in most of us human beings, that it is so easy to catastrophize things that we fear might happen in the future, such that we equate many things as being eternal punishment and of a very painful nature too. This is not surprising, especially with our modern media and in America, whereby if we were to watch the news on any day or any evening, we would see a number of things that would frighten us greatly on the news, and I would say tend to make us catastrophize what happens, such that we would catastrophize death, maiming, assaults, violence, and loss of property. When in fact, if we only stepped back and considered what could be even worse, in other words, eternal punishment, then that would perhaps set things in perspective. Indeed, I was quite interested a year or two ago to discover that the Chinese had or have notions of eternal punishment that are even worse in their eyes than the Christians' belief in hell as punishment, if you can imagine. And so even that is relative of a sort. But also an observation of mine in the last couple years is that many of our conceptions of pain are highly colored by feelings of shame as to whether or not we had prepared beforehand for it or allowed it to happen, so to speak. The notion being that we might be blamed by someone for feeling pain if crippled, say, in some fashion, blamed for not preventing it, if you will. And this blame, this shame incurred in us, feeling oftentimes much more painful than the physical pain itself, ironically, or any losses of property or any other such thing. So this would be something I think we could really stand to take a look at. Indeed, there are a few people who have talked at length about the greatest fear being the fear of death, and that if only we could conquer our fear of death, there would be little else we would fear. Now, I'm not so sure I buy into all of that, but I think the overall idea is that we definitely should not be catastrophizing pain of any sort, unless we think there is some way it could last forever and be excruciating. And if we believe that, we're probably going to have to come to some accommodation. For instance, the Christians accommodating to that by becoming of a sufficient nature that they believe this wouldn't happen. Or, additionally, the idea in several religions that come to mind that no matter how much we suffer, it makes it bearable to think that there will be paradise afterward. A pot of gold at the end of the rainbow, if you will. In other words, the Christian's doctrine of heaven, or let's say the doctrine in the Muslim faith of having 72 virgins accorded to you after you die. Again, the notion or idea, right or wrong, that anything is bearable if you know there will be an immense reward at the end, and that reward will in fact last forever. That makes things bearable, just as we remind ourselves on a day-to-day basis, if working a job we hate, that at least we are counting on this big vacation we're planning 3 months in advance, and this vacation somehow makes the job bearable. And so again, there being a vital purpose to counting on a reward, or paradise even, after what we are going through right now, or fear might happen that could be painful for a limited period of time. Finally, I think the crux too, beyond trying to fight catastrophizing things and reckoning with eternal punishment, would be to remember that life is short. We don't like to think of that, I know, but the thought can in fact be comforting, I think, to realize that no matter what we have coming up in the future, whether we can plan it away or not, or buy our way out of it, or whatever, that it is going to be of limited duration, whether we like that fact or not. And this little realization is, in a sense, what I call a blessing. You might say it's a blessing that we don't live forever and suffer whatever pains we might have forever. We have built in from nature, if you will, or a creator, an out, and that out is death. It can rescue us, and the simple reminding ourselves of this fact from time to time, I think, can be comforting in a strange sort of way. So these are my thoughts on fears. When I've had specific fears that trouble me, and especially when I can't seem to plan them away or build up resources for them. I hope this is helpful, it doesn't get down to the specifics, I know, of particular fears we might all have right at the present time. But I hope it stirs up some additional thinking that's going to be useful. I wish you well.